Women are the real architects of the society. As we celebrate this International Women's Day, let's understand how women move in our cities, what are their challenges, and what are the opportunities to make it better and improve. I am Pawan Mulukutla, Executive Program Director for Integrated Transport, Clean Air and Hydrogen at WRI-India. With me today is Professor Inés de Madariaga, UNESCO Chair on Gender, Professor of Urban Planning at University of Madrid, and a pioneer who coined the phrase mobility of care. Welcome to India, Inés.
Good morning. Thank you very much. I'm really happy to be here today with you.
How did you start your journey? What did you think when you were thinking about the whole mobility in our cities?
Well, in fact, I started thinking about women and cities and women in architecture when I was a student. I was on a Fulbright grant student in New York City at Columbia University. I was just a very young architect doing my master's degree, and I saw there was a class that was being offered on women and architecture.
Okay.
And I thought, what is this? I thought, it rings familiar because I come from a family in which there were so many women and very few men because of the war and other reasons. So I had this feminist consciousness since very young. And then when I saw that class on women and architecture at Columbia University, I thought, oh, there's something that relates my things of my life with my profession. Then I came back to Spain. Then in a few years, I did my PhD. I became a professor. And when I became a professor in 1999, the first thing I did was to get some research grants money to do research on women and cities.
Wow.
Yes. It was the first time that any school of architecture in Spain would produce any research on women and cities, women in architecture.
Probably the first in the world.
No, not the first in the world. There was, as I said, a number of academics in the United States who were working on that topic. And there were some experiences also in the UK, in the Scandinavian countries, in the city of Vienna. But I did create the first research group on gender in planning and architecture in Spain and probably also in Europe at the time, in around 1990. So that was many years ago.
Probably I was just playing around on the streets that time.
Yes, and so I started doing research on women and planning, women in cities. And I got, then I wanted to work into government. I had some experience as an advisor to the Minister of Housing and Urban Affairs.
Okay.
I was in her cabinet for 2 and something years, and I was able to introduce some articles on women and cities and women and infrastructure, women and housing policies into Spanish land use legislation and also into Spanish equality legislation. That was about the year 2007. When I came back to university in 2008, I got a commission from the Ministry of Transportation to produce a gender analysis of the main Spanish databases on transportation. The main
And
Spanish
why was that triggered?
I proposed to them. All my first commissions, it was me who reached out.
And that's why you're a pioneer.
I got the initiative and I got positive responses, sometimes some others. I didn't, but many times I did. So I proposed some people at the Ministry of Transportation to fund this research. They did. And I did this gender analysis of the transportation service. There were 4 different transportation services that existed at that time in Spain. And I found a number of gender biases, gender omissions. And when I had finished this work, it was like a lighting bulb that came up in my mind. And I saw there are all these trips like shopping, escorting people, accompanying others, visiting, strolling, that are made mostly by women, which seem unimportant because they are like smaller categories, because for transportation planners, they always look at employment trips and educational trips, and they call this bunch of trips, they call them compulsory travel.
But all these other trips are so important, right? And in a country like India, I mean, these are the kind of trips that are happening throughout the day.
Yes, but for planners at the time, they didn't look important because they were like smaller number of trips many different categories. So I had this idea that when I had read all these scholarship on women, I had seen that the concept of care understood as all the work that is done for the reproduction of life, for the caring of others, for having a household work. This care concept was a core concept in women's studies. And then what came to my mind was that all these trips that mostly women are doing on an everyday basis for the sustaining of life, so that everyday life can work, are really trips that women mostly do for the care, for what feminists or women's scholarship calls care. So I said, if we give all these trips that today seem unimportant because it looks like they are few because they are under smaller categories, we give them an umbrella term. We name them. The power of naming, of having a name, really creates concepts and ways of understanding reality in ways that can better suit a different perspective, from a women's perspective, what transportation systems look like. So,
in fact, what you say makes so much sense, because I used to do transportation modeling, and when we did all this modeling, all we talked about was home-based work trips, home-based shopping, and we used to say home-based other and non-home-based. This whole concept of care-based trips was never actually even discussed.
No, I invented it. So it came to my mind, what if we give this umbrella name, mobility of care, that encompasses all these trips that today are really not counted for because they're under many different categories. They look like they're not important, but under an umbrella term, you will see the real amount of these trips, and you will be able to make them visible and to quantify them, and to see what's the proportion of all the trips that could be considered care trips. And probably they will be very close in number to trips related to employment.
And what did you find?
Well, then after a few years, like 3-4 years later, I had a student of mine who did her PhD on this. We developed a specific survey methodology because you cannot really count them using conventional surveying questionnaires. So you have to specifically design a questionnaire that allows to measure them. And we applied that to the region of Madrid. And we found that effectively the number of trips was very, very close to the trip related to employment.
Oh, wow.
Yes. Yes.
And all these years we have been doing our transportation planning without taking into account or paying much needed attention to these trips.
Yes, because it looked like they were not important, because in numbers they seemed very small. But when you give them a name and count them as of course some are related to shopping, others might be escorting, others might be visiting people who are sick, or bringing under the black box others. There are many trips that are related to care. So when you can name them, you can make them visible.
So has this, what you have coined, congratulations on that, but has this been used and adopted by other cities as they are starting to plan? I also understand you actually advise and work with several cities across the world. If you could share some of your experience.
Yes. Well, I published this for the first time in 2009, this research, and then in 2013, this work appeared in a very important project by the European Commission and Stanford University called the Gender Innovations Project. This is a worldwide tool for giving tools to researchers and policymakers on how to integrate gender dimensions in STEM-related fields.
Okay.
So after that, the Inter-American Development Bank, their transportation people saw that European Commission publication of my work, and they made a post on their blog on mobility of care. They invited me to speak about it in Mexico, and then I started receiving invitations from many places in Argentina, in Colombia, in many places. And after a while, I have seen that researchers around the world are applying it. In Oxford, in Harvard, MIT, McGill University, and it has been put into legislation by the government of Mexico, the government of Jalisco, which is the city of Bogota has applied it in they call it care blocks.
In fact, I was last year in Bogota and actually visited some of the care blocks.
Yes.
And it was quite fascinating to see, and that was my first time getting exposed to this concept.
Yes.
And it was quite interesting that how we really start looking at our development of city and start integrating women to make it more inclusive, and even look at their livelihoods. What are the opportunities for them? And this was amazing.
Yes, yes. Of course, mobility of care is part of a wider understanding of how cities take care issues into account, because it's not only mobility, it's also urban planning, generally speaking. And transportation needs to be integrated with urban planning in order to it be reaching to where the people need to have the accessibility properly working.
So I wanted to understand, how does the travel pattern of women differ from those of men? Is it same? Is it different? Because what I understand is, looks like because of this mobility trips related to care, it sounds like it'll be different.
Yes, travel patterns are very different, and we have known this for many years of research now. And we also know that these travel patterns are different across the world, and they don't change. They have not changed substantially in time either. We know that women use much more public transportation. They do many more trips on foot. Their trips are shorter and closer to the home. They follow more of a polygonal pattern than commuting from the home to employment, and they are shorter in time. So it's very different way of moving around the city. And of course, this is related to the fact that women take care of all these care tasks, and also more and more work in paid employment as well. So they have to combine care and employment.
And have you seen any changes in recent times where men are also taking more care-related mobility trips, or you see it still is dominated in a way that women are actually doing these trips, right?
We are seeing that there is not much substantial change. Before the pandemic, the gender gap in mobility and care tasks in some countries was slowly closing a little bit, but with the pandemic, it has again opened up the gap. So we are not seeing substantial changes, no.
Okay. And it was quite fascinating to also read about your work, how other countries are doing. What are some of the examples on how this is being integrated, and what is the difference actually it is making on ground?
I would like to mention like 2 or 3 kinds of examples. One of them is the design of stops and train stations, take into account gender issues which have to deal with safety devices of the design of space, and also convenience and quality of the spatial aspects of stations and bus stops. Those are very important. We have been doing this, for instance, with a rail train company in Spain. We have been working on that, and we have also advised them on the procurement, so that in all the contracts for the renovation of stations, all these gender issues are compulsory taken into account. That's one example. Okay. Another example is related to pricing systems and fare, the definition of fares, and how you can use pricing and fare systems to support the mobility of women or certain income brackets or certain family configurations. One example is Guipúzcoa region in Spain, with whom we have also worked and advised them on their pricing system. And the third example that is very important to my mind is how to integrate these transport-related dimensions of gender mobility patterns with planning instruments. And we have done this work, for instance, in the land use legislation of the region of Extremadura in Spain, in which we have integrated gender dimensions across the planning and transportation planning system at all the scales and in all planning instruments through legislation. And then in the region of the Basque Country in Spain as well, we have done the same thing for the regional plan, And we have also done this at municipal level in the city of Madrid, in the project Madrid Nuevo Norte. So that is integrating mobility issues with planning and urban design issues, taking into account the gender and how women move around together in the design solutions that both address physical planning and transportation and mobility.
Excellent. I know it's quite fascinating to hear about, we talk about public spaces and how do we really integrate and not see transportation planning completely in isolation, but, has part of the city planning. That's quite fantastic. And the examples are quite interesting on how we can actually learn and kind of integrate this in some of the emerging economies as well. I also wanted to ask, the importance of collecting disaggregated data and what does that reveal?
Yes, such disaggregated data is very important because to have proper policy, you need a good empirical base, and for that data you absolutely need it. When we did the study for the region of Madrid, we found that the difference between employment-related mobility and care-related mobility was only about 4 points. 4 points difference. And when you would disaggregate this between men and women, the difference was 20 points.
Whoa.
So men do very, very little trips related to mobility of care. The data were very clear, and I'm looking forward to see this kind of study in other regions.
No, I think it's extremely important because we always think that everyone is traveling uniformly and then you start planning your cities accordingly. But once you realize that there are different needs, I think then the kind of infrastructure that we are going to put also becomes inclusive. Absolutely. My final question to you, Inés, is as we actually, right, that 75% of the infrastructure in India is yet to be built. And as we plan this expansion over the next couple of years and decades, how do you think emerging economies should be planning gender inclusive mobility?
Well, I think this is an incredible opportunity to do it right for women. So, because you have this work ahead to do to build the new infrastructure, this can be done in ways that better respond to women's needs and to women's travel patterns. So, how can this be done? How should this be done? I think that it's very important first to have gender expertise going into decision-making processes and planning and design processes, and also to have women's participation in the planning labor force and in decision-making is also very important. But you need both things, women's participation and gender expertise. And for women participation in the transportation sector in particular, there's quite a lot of evidence that you need to address issues of safety in the workplace and issues of family conciliation, personal life, work-life balance. And then, of course, you need to get into the way you plan the infrastructure systems, all these issues that we have identified in academic research that are relevant for women, what the travel patterns are, safety devices, how transportation is needed for women to better access employment opportunities and to be able to balance care issues with employment. So this new planning phase and new opportunities, I think, should be really looking at how women, what are women needs regarding transportation systems and planning our cities, your cities, and the cities around the world.
Yeah, no, fantastic. I think extremely enlightening conversation personally for me. The need for gender expertise, the need for women to be part of the planning, part of the decision making, and not just as beneficiaries, and how we really start looking at data to really drive the decision making, right? We're talking about science-based decision making, and this is extremely amazing experience personally for me to really learn from you, world-renowned expert on this. And thank you so much for your time, Inés, and enjoy rest of your stay in India, and I hope we soon catch up in some part of the world.
Thank you so much. It's been my great pleasure to be here with you. It's been a really wonderful experience. Thank you very much.
Thank you.